Victor Hale, the untouchable financier with secrets no one dared to question. Laura Bennett, the relentless journalist who risked everything to expose the truth. Marcus Reed, the former security officer who saw too much and could never stay silent. Evelyn Carter, the analyst piecing together the fragmented files. Daniel Moore, the mysterious whistleblower who held the keys to hidden networks. Sarah Collins, the survivor determined to make her voice heard. Thomas Wright, the federal investigator, chasing a system designed to protect itself. And Olivia Hayes, the data expert unraveling the digital trails. All of them are connected by a web of power, deception, and danger that hides in plain sight, where every revelation brings them closer to a truth no one is ready to face. Jeffrey Epstein presented himself as a man who existed beyond normal rules. He moved through elite spaces with ease, surrounded by wealth that seemed endless and connections that appeared unquestionable. To the outside world, he was described as a brilliant financier, someone trusted by billionaires and institutions alike. His lifestyle reflected that image: private aircraft, luxury properties in multiple countries, and security teams that ensured complete privacy. Yet no one could clearly explain how he built his fortune, and that mystery was often ignored rather than challenged. Behind the polished image was a pattern that quietly raised concern. Young women were frequently seen entering his residences, often leaving hours later without explanation. Staff members noticed unusual routines, strict confidentiality agreements, and an atmosphere where questions were discouraged. Everything about Epstein's world was designed to operate in silence. The people around him benefited from his generosity, and those who depended on him understood that loyalty meant survival. Over time, whispers began to circulate in legal and social circles. Allegations of exploitation surfaced, then vanished just as quickly. Complaints were filed, but investigations stalled. Records went missing, and witnesses withdrew their statements. Each failed attempt to hold Epstein accountable only strengthened the belief that he was protected by forces far more powerful than himself. What made Epstein truly dangerous was not just the crimes he was accused of, but the structure he built around them. He cultivated relationships with individuals who had influence over law, finance, and media. His wealth was a tool, his secrecy a weapon. By the time authorities began to look more closely, his network was already deeply embedded within the system meant to stop him. Epstein was not just hiding in the shadows. He was hiding behind respectability, where suspicion rarely dared to look. The island was officially described as a private retreat, a place meant for rest and isolation. From the air, it looked peaceful, surrounded by clear water and guarded by distance. On the ground, however, everything followed strict rules. Security cameras covered every corner, and access was controlled with precision. Visitors arrived on private aircraft or boats that were never publicly logged, ensuring no official record of who came or when they left. The island existed almost outside the reach of law. Local workers were hired under tight conditions. They were told where they could go and when they could leave. Certain buildings were completely off-limits, even to long-term staff. Anyone who questioned these boundaries was quickly removed and replaced. Confidentiality agreements made sure that silence followed them long after their employment ended. The message was clear: the island was not a place for curiosity. Survivors later described the island as carefully designed to confuse and control. Rooms were soundproofed, schedules were unpredictable, and movements were monitored at all times. There were no clocks, no clear sense of day or night, and no access to the outside world. This isolation made it difficult for anyone to understand how long they had been there or what exactly had happened. The environment itself worked as a psychological trap. What made the island especially powerful was its invisibility. Authorities rarely visited, and when they did, inspections were announced well in advance. Any evidence that could raise concern disappeared before anyone arrived. The island was protected not only by geography, but by influence. Its existence depended on people who chose not to ask questions. To outsiders, it remained a rumor, a curiosity dismissed as conspiracy. To those who experienced it, the island was something else entirely. It was a place built to erase responsibility, where secrets were buried beneath luxury and silence, and where the absence of. The first cracks in the silence appeared quietly, almost unnoticed. A small batch of sealed court documents surfaced through an unrelated legal process, released without explanation and buried deep in public records. At first glance, the pages seemed harmless: heavily redacted names, fragmented timelines, and references to events without context. But to investigators and journalists who knew where to look, the omissions were louder than the words themselves. Something was being hidden, and it was being hidden carefully. As analysts examined the documents, patterns began to emerge. Dates aligned with known travel records, yet destinations were missing. Financial transactions appeared without clear sources, moving through layers of shell companies designed to blur accountability. The files suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Epstein was no longer seen as an isolated offender, but as part of a structure that required planning, funding, and protection. What unsettled investigators most was how incomplete the files felt. Key pages were missing, entire sections removed, and evidence referenced but never attached. It became clear that these documents were never meant to tell the full story. They were fragments, possibly released by mistake or through internal conflict. Even so, they revealed enough to confirm long-held suspicions that powerful individuals were involved. Media outlets hesitated to report on the findings. Legal risks, pressure from influential figures, and fear of retaliation slowed coverage. Stories were softened, details omitted, and focus redirected. Public attention flickered briefly, then moved on. Meanwhile, those studying the files understood that this was only the surface. The leaks changed everything. Once the idea of hidden files entered public awareness, the scandal could no longer be contained. Requests for unsealed records increased, whistleblowers grew bolder, and anonymous tips began to flood investigators. The truth was no lawn. As investigators pushed deeper, the trail consistently led to the same conclusion: money was the engine that kept everything running. Financial records showed vast sums moving through banks with little scrutiny, protected by legal loopholes and privileged relationships. Donations, consulting fees, and investments flowed into institutions that, in return, offered something far more valuable than profit: protection. Every transaction seemed designed not just to grow wealth, but to buy silence. Legal interference became impossible to ignore. Complaints were downgraded, charges quietly reduced, and jurisdictional disputes stalled progress. When local authorities attempted to move forward, higher offices intervened. Files were transferred, responsibilities blurred, and accountability dissolved into bureaucracy. Each delay worked in favor of those with the most to lose. Justice did not fail all at once. It weakened gradually, until it could no longer stand. The files hinted at an unspoken agreement among powerful circles. Access to influence meant access to immunity. Invitations, favors, and introductions created invisible debts. These connections formed a safety net that caught Epstein every time he fell. Even when evidence surfaced, it was handled with unusual caution, as if touching it carried consequences. Media coverage followed a similar pattern. Investigative pieces were edited down, stories lost momentum, and editors faced pressure from advertisers and legal teams. The narrative was carefully controlled, focusing on Epstein alone while avoiding the wider network suggested by the evidence. The public was given a villain, but not the system that allowed him to thrive. What made this phase especially disturbing was its familiarity. The structure revealed by the files was not unique. It mirrored how power had protected itself for decades. Money bought influence, influence shaped law, and law determined whose lives mattered. Epstein did not create this system. Epstein's arrest briefly reignited public hope that the truth would finally emerge. For the first time, the man who had avoided consequences for decades was placed inside a system meant to restrain him. Cameras followed every update, and analysts predicted that his testimony could unravel an entire network. He was no longer protected by distance or secrecy. Yet, even inside custody, the sense of control around him did not disappear. Procedures were adjusted, routines altered, and oversight appeared strangely inconsistent. As the days passed, irregularities mounted. Important paperwork was delayed, cell assignments changed without clear reasoning, and monitoring protocols failed at critical moments. Each breakdown was later described as an accident, a mistake, or simple human error. Taken alone, none seemed extraordinary. Together, They formed a pattern that felt impossible to ignore. The same system that had failed to stop Epstein for years now struggled to contain him. When news of his death reached the public, shock quickly turned into suspicion. Official explanations focused on exhaustion, understaffing, and procedural lapses. Surveillance footage was missing, guards had not followed protocol, and records were incomplete. The timing raised immediate questions. Epstein had represented a living threat to many powerful figures, and now he was gone before he could testify. With his death, legal proceedings abruptly stalled. Ongoing investigations lost their central figure, and potential evidence tied directly to him became harder to verify. The focus shifted from accountability to technical explanations. Public attention fractured, divided between disbelief and fatigue. What remained was a silence heavier than before. Epstein's death did not close the case, it froze it. Files remained sealed, names stayed hidden, and unanswered questions multiplied. The man at the center of the scandal was gone, but the structure surrounding him remained untouched. Whatever truths. After Epstein's death, the expectation was that the story would slowly fade. Instead, something unexpected happened. New documents began to surface, released anonymously through legal filings, investigative journalists, and independent researchers. These were not the same fragmented records seen before. They contained clearer timelines, travel data, and financial references that suggested Epstein had prepared for this moment. It appeared he had created backups, copies meant to survive him. The disclosures pointed to encrypted digital archives stored across multiple jurisdictions. Data experts noticed patterns indicating deliberate distribution, making it difficult for any single authority to erase everything. Flight logs reappeared with partial passenger information. Calendars showed recurring visits tied to coded symbols rather than names. Financial transfers linked Epstein's accounts to unfamiliar entities that operated far beyond U.S. borders. Each new release caused a brief wave of outrage. Headlines returned, social media exploded, and officials promised transparency. But the attention never lasted. Documents were often labeled unverified, context was questioned, and legal complexities slowed interpretation. By the time analysts began connecting the dots, public focus had already shifted elsewhere. What made this wave different was the absence of Epstein himself. Without him, responsibility became harder to assign. Lawyers argued over relevance, courts debated jurisdiction, and agencies passed responsibility between departments. The files existed, but no one seemed eager to fully open them. Still, the disclosures changed the narrative. They confirmed that Epstein had not acted impulsively. Everything had been planned with long-term protection in mind. His operation functioned like a corporation, with redundancies built to survive collapse. Even in death, he controlled the flow of information. The second wave did not deliver justice, but it ensured certainty. While documents and investigations dominated headlines, the people most affected remained largely unseen. Survivors carried the weight of what had happened to them long after public attention moved on. Many came forward believing the system would protect them, only to discover how difficult it was to be heard. Legal processes moved slowly, and every step required reliving trauma under intense scrutiny. Their credibility was questioned, their memories dissected, and their lives exposed. Some cases ended in quiet settlements. Money was exchanged, agreements were signed, and silence became legally binding. These resolutions were presented as closure, but for many survivors, they felt like erasure. Settlements avoided trials, prevented testimony, and ensured that details never reached the public record. Justice was replaced with confidentiality, leaving the larger truth untouched. The files revealed how survivors were often treated as risks rather than victims. Internal communications described damage control strategies, reputation management, and legal containment. The focus was never on healing, only on limiting exposure. Institutions that claimed neutrality distanced themselves, citing technicalities and jurisdictional limits. Responsibility was constantly redirected. Public support surged briefly during major revelations, but it faded just as quickly. Media cycles moved on, and survivors were left to rebuild their lives without answers. Some faced harassment, disbelief, or professional consequences simply for speaking out. Others chose anonymity, fearing retaliation from a system that had already failed them once. What remained was a deep imbalance. Those with power retained their influence, while those without it carried lifelong consequences. The files documented crimes, but they could not restore what was taken. Survivors became living evidence of a system that prioritized protection over people. Their stories, even when incomplete, exposed the human cost age. The Epstein files remain suspended between exposure and disappearance. Some documents are still sealed by courts, others locked behind legal appeals, and many rumored to have been destroyed or quietly archived beyond reach. What exists publicly feels unfinished, like a story interrupted at its most critical moment. Each release promises answers, yet delivers only fragments, enough to confirm wrongdoing but not enough to dismantle the structure that allowed it to exist. Over time, the scandal transformed from a criminal case into a symbol. It exposed how influence can outlast evidence and how truth can be managed rather than revealed. Investigations slowed, public interest weakened, and institutions returned to normal operations. The absence of final accountability created a dangerous precedent, suggesting that power does not need innocence to survive, only patience. The files themselves became objects of controversy. Some viewed them as proof waiting to be unlocked, others as weapons too disruptive to fully reveal. Governments cited national interest, courts cited procedure, and agencies cited limitations. Each justification added another layer between the public and closure. The question was no longer who was involved, but why full transparency remained impossible. What endured was uncertainty. Survivors waited for recognition, journalists waited for confirmation, and the public waited for a conclusion that never arrived. The lack of an ending became the ending itself. Silence replaced outrage, and unresolved facts faded into background noise. The scandal closed without resolution, but not without consequence. It left behind a warning etched into modern history. When systems protect themselves over justice, truth does not disappear, it lingers. It waits in sealed files, forgotten servers, and unanswered questions. And as long as those questions remain, the story is not over. It is merely unfinished, suspended in darkness, where power has learned how to hide in.